Good afternoon, everyone. And I think that time is here. It's welcome to Schools Forum for this meeting today. If we will start with apologies, please.
Through you, Chair, we have apologies for non-attendance from Ginny Bootman, John Lake, Lee Hughes and Andrew Reid of Forum members, and also from Beth Bain, Senior Finance Business Partner. And we have Rachel Martin and Tracy Carter of Forum members joining us remotely, other members in the room.
Thank you, James. Are there any declarations of interest that haven't already been declared in our usual way that relate to the items on the agenda? No? Okay. If I can go to the minutes, I won't run through the minutes specifically, but are there any questions about the minutes, or are Forum members happy for us to sign them? Yep, I can see Tracy, Rachel. Everyone happy with them? Okay, then I'll sign the minutes. Thank you. I'll go on. Yeah. Thank you very much. And we'll move on to high needs, which we'd asked to be looked at first. Andy.
Okay, thank you, Chair. As a starting point, I would like to actually again apologise for the delays in the responses that schools in particular have had over the last number of months with regards to the funding and in particular the likes of the RAS band appeals. I will come on to these in more detail in the next few minutes. And we acknowledge that this has caused some concerns at schools, but want to reassure Forum members and for them to again reassure schools that we are making progress. The positive part of the progress is driven by the increase in resource. So since the last meeting, as Ben said, we now have a new head of SEND, Dr. Louisa Jones has joined. We have 3 new EHC service managers who are embedding in their roles. We have 2 interim EHC officers and a permanent EHC officer. So that is then adding strength, which is helping with the clearance of the backlog. We've also got back up to full strength on the education funding team. And that is key when we're looking at the number of payment queries. We've not cleared all the backlog, but we are making progress. And I wanted to give that balance today with the apologies, but also the what are we doing about it. If I then, as a first part, pick out some key points on the report, on the paper with regards to EHCP and the RAS funding, and then just a couple of moments later, then look at the non-EHC, the targeted SEND funding. At the previous meeting, I did highlight that we were behind with the early years payments. I'm pleased to say that by the end of December, we caught up on those payments. There are still some amendments to be done, which is based on the pro rata number of hours for these children. But I am assured by the team that all those queries will be completed by the end of January. So were completed by the end of January. So we've caught up with this. If we then take the school age payments, where there were more queries, and we still do have a number, that number is coming down. Because we have more resource, it's not a quick fix. It is something that we are working over a number of weeks. There are multiple people working on it, but it is reducing. And we do believe this is now a manageable list, and that each of the queries are being handled to one of our team. And the head of SEND, Louisa Jones, is also now, on the ones which have been escalated to her, is now working through on a recovery plan with those. One of the other things that's happened since the last meeting is we've been able to send out our RAS funding statement 3 to schools. Now, just to remind Forum members, in the last academic year, we had 1 statement. In this academic year, this is our 3rd, and we will have 4. There'll be another one in May. And this is helping us to get better and better accuracy of the cohorts within the schools. And by getting the cohorts correct, so it means that the objective is to pay the right school, the right level of funding at the right time. But again, this is an ongoing process, and there will be, as I say, there'll be a further statement made in May. We were planning to send that statement before Christmas, but we actually put that on hold to do it after Christmas because we wanted to do an audit on the payment protection, because this was a key topic. And in the paper, I did say that we believe, at this moment in time, our number of schools receiving payment protection has gone down from 57 to below 40. That number at this moment in time is 37, which means there are 20 less schools than originally estimated to receiving payment protection. That number is not the final number. Beth Baines has asked me to highlight that when we get to the end of the financial year and we do the final reconciliation, that number could adjust a little. And the reason for the change is the movement of young people. So when you get to the start of the new term, you get some changes again, and the payment protection follows, is only for the school at the beginning, as we said, in May last year. On the flip side of a reduction of 20 schools, that means that there are 20 more schools getting increases in funding. But again, that number will be available in April, I will say April, possibly early May. One of the other things which is moving forward is the embedding of what we refer to as the RASBAN triggers. RASBAN appeals is only one of the triggers, and the trigger is when do we look at a RASBAN, and that's based on the review of a needs profile form. And this now is also becoming more embedded because we're looking at changes, amendment notices at the time of phase transfers, we're looking at annual reviews. So it could be that a RASBAN actually changes 2 or even 3 times per year. And then as that changes, depending on the level of need, and the need could go up or could go down, the associated funding would change at that as well. And with the RASBAN appeals, at the previous meeting, I do believe I highlighted that we had 78, which was just under 5%, so 1 in 20. That has increased since I've done the paper because we've had a number of appeals. We're communicating to schools they don't need to hold off, that they can do appeals. We've had 19 more over the last number of days, but we are still sitting at 96 in total at this moment in time, which is still 5%, so 1 in 20, which means we've had 95% which have not appealed at this moment in time. Of the ones which were received by the end of November, 97% have now been reviewed by an EHC officer, and any which have been upheld by the officer, we have looked at making the payment change immediately so that into our Capital One system, so that the payment changes as fast as we can. There is still a delay on some of these schools receiving the feedback, but we are working with the teams with this this increase in resource to actually communicate to schools. And one of the things which we've also looked at, and this, I omitted this in error from the pre-meeting, is we're looking at doing some review of the process for the RASBAN appeals. This process has been in place since 2017 for special schools. In 2025, it's time to review the process. So we are looking at reviewing the administration, the process, the guidance notes, but also the timing of RASBAN appeals as well. It's important to align these, in addition to the way we're currently doing it, to actually look at this in line with the statutory dates, to align with the annual reviews. So at this moment in time, I don't have any further detail. One of my colleagues will share that detail in the future. But, and apologies, Chair, Vice Chair, I omitted that on the pre-briefing. The situation with the payment protection is that as we believe that the majority of the payment queries have been resolved, the RASBAN appeal backlog is manageable. We have a recovery plan in place. We need to look at the more recent ones. And the fact that we've got mechanisms in place for schools to make appeals, we are not recommending the extension of the 100% payment protection from the 1st of April. So from the 1st of April, we are planning to continue with the 50% payment protection for the next financial year and then 25% protection for the following year. For forum members will recall that we said that the budget for this financial year was £300,000. We are ahead of that budget now. Based on our expectations at the end of the financial year, we will be looking at something in the region of £370,000. But the original budget was set based on 75% protection. So when you move to 100%, you expect to spend more. But I wanted to highlight to Forum that we actually have fully committed the payment protection budget for this financial year. That was the update from an EHCP perspective. I would like to just take another moment and update Forum on the targeted SEND funding, which used to be called high needs funding. The positive news is we have the school age application form now live. That did have some delays, which was based on resource. But again, want to highlight to Forum that no schools have lost out on the increased level of fundings because that was available since the 1st of September. And another point which wasn't in the pre-meeting because I wasn't aware at that time, but Louisa Jones, our new head of SEND, has now initiated a further review of targeted SEND for school age. If you recall, we kicked off this particular project in September 2022. We're now completing the elements of the project, the deliverables in the beginning of 2025. Rather than waiting a number of years, we are now kicking off another review, which is to focus on the elements such as what other support is in place, how do we look at the measurements of the success of this activity. And in Head West previous week, sorry, get my dates mixed up, an expression of interest was sent out to schools, and so far Louisa has received, so we have received over 20 schools asking to participate in that next review. Forum members may remember that 2 years ago we did say this will be in multiple parts, and I wanted to apologise, Chair, Vice Chair, I wasn't aware of this on that when we had the pre-meeting. We've also made sure that we are communicating the 2 extra points, which is the targeted SEND funding next stage and the looking at the topics around the review of the process of RASBAN appeals. We have communicated that in the funding and forms training which took place last week, and also we'll be doing it again on Thursday, and we will communicate that to schools as we've looked at doing throughout. Apologies for the long duration of this verbal update to the paper. There's a lot of content, but that's the update for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Can I open it up to forum members with any questions for Andy on the high needs paper? Liza?
Can I just ask, in terms of the review, we were talking about, I think it was 2 years ago when we said we would look at the ranges and how they are matching. Is that going to form part of the review as well? Particularly with, I'm in conversation with Fran at the moment about how some of the ranges, the provision that we actually have in our small schools, that is our everyday provision. So for some of our children, when they get to year 5 and 6, parents start panicking, and that's where we get the influx of EHCPs going through. So our issue is actually it's the ranges that need reviewing in line with provision. So is that on the agenda to be looked at as well?
Do you want me to jump in on that one?
Please.
Quick answer, Eliza, yes. Yeah, we're not going to look at this in individual little bits. We're looking at it in the round. And Andy's already said a couple of times, with new people coming in, with now the management and leadership capacity to look at all of this work as well, we want to do ordinarily available ranges, top of everything. So we've got a really good overview of where we are. That actually feeds into, and I'll do a bit more update later on the agenda around our deficit management plan as well. So yeah, we need to look at it all in the round, definitely.
Yes. I'll take this feedback back to Louisa. The scope has not been clearly defined defined in detail at this moment in time. She has sent an expression of interest to schools, but I'll feed that back. Thank you.
Thank you. Dan?
Okay, yeah, sorry, there's a few points if you're happy just for me to kind of go through and we can systematically work through them if we want. I guess the first one is to raise concerns around the review. And I think the element of concern around that is that we are effectively reviewing many mechanisms that have just been implemented. I accept that there are some that have not, but I think that shows an element of naivety. So, for example, the appeals process regarding the special schools have had since 2007, I think it was always clear that that wasn't necessarily always going to be transferable to a mainstream provision, yet we've made those mistakes and we're now going to review them in a relatively short amount of time. So although I think review is good, these concerns were raised during Schools Forum over the last 2 years. So it's refreshing that we're going to have that, but I do think it's important to suggest that, you know, they were raised previously. I think what I'd also like to add, if I move on to another point, is it's disappointing regarding the decline for the request for schools regarding payment protection. The premise of that, or the reason, in my understanding of regarding the rationale, was that schools were unable to set budgets, and that was a safety mechanism in order to be able to support those schools. Unfortunately, schools are still no clearer on what their funding is going to look like. So the kind of point of asking for that protection was to allow the authority time to be confident that we had the right funding in place for those mainstream schools. So I don't know if we want to start with those 2 points and I can carry on, or would you like me just to carry on and we can kind of go from there?
No, I think, Andy or Ben, would you like to address those to start with?
If we take the RASBand appeals, if you're looking at 95% of schools have not placed an appeal, but have had the opportunity since June, I'm not sure how that defines as being a negative.
I would say it actually, what it does is shows a lack of trust in the system. I've sent evidence to you, Andy, that caseworkers are telling schools not to make those appeals. I've sent that email to you. We have schools that have made appeals placed in July and are only having responses last week. We are being asked to make appeals based on no modelling. We are given a document that we need to complete without any kind of guidance around how to complete that, what level of depth of information you require. I think the actual statistics demonstrate my point completely. The reason there is only 3 that you've highlighted within there that you say is surprising to you, I think is an acknowledgement that you're expecting more. And I think that's fair, a fair assumption. But the reason that they haven't was because A, we've been told not to, B, we've not received any response at all, and we've received no guidance around how to do that. So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to, you know, professionally disagree with you that the evidence that you've presented actually backs what I'm saying.
I do actually disagree, Chair, on this particular point. We, whilst Dan does highlight that we have had an example where one of the caseworkers mistakenly pushed back on a school to say, do not make an appeal. And I think yourself have highlighted that we've had other schools who've said we've been told to delay this. We have communicated to all schools that this process is transparent and it is available for all schools. We have committed in the pre-meeting to send communication. And I was holding off sending or drafting the communication for Ben to send because I wanted to highlight to Forum first about this review. I think it's important to wrap this into one communication message. And I think it is, we do have a danger if we're not careful of taking the experience of a small number of schools and saying that's the experience of all schools.
But wouldn't the data suggest that though, Andy? Wouldn't you suggest that the data you've presented, in fact, actually supports what I'm suggesting to you?
Not at all. No, I think it's the opposite case.
Ben, would you like to?
First, very happy to have challenge around how we do this. There isn't a right answer, there isn't a wrong answer. What I just want to go back to is this has been done in complete openness and collaboration with a number of schools and providers. So we've had lots of different suggestions about how we do or don't roll out RAS banding that we brought in. Remember, when we started this process, there were over 400 different rates of funding children within West Northampton. Completely unsustainable, completely unmanageable, and frankly, completely unfair. That was based on personal relationships and discussions. There was no structure to it, no clarity about how we will fund, and frankly, no control over the budget. What we've had to do is try and bring a control in and a consistency in around decision-making, which is what Andy's been presenting. I think running a 95% success rate, if that's what we deem it is now, I think that's really positive. The other thing, and I know we'll talk about this later, is we as a schools forum are accountable for making sure we don't overspend our DSG. You'll hear shortly, it's £19 million overspent. We have to do something about bringing the expenditure in West Northampton under control. This is one of our levers to it. This is not, and we've listened all the way along. So we brought in 100% protection. That was the right thing to do in year. We cannot continue doing it, or there was no point doing the exercise in the first place if we're just going to protect everybody at previous levels. And that will not, ultimately, we're going to have to sit in front of the Education Skills Funding Agency, the DfE's funding arm, very shortly and justify the decisions that we are making. I don't think we would ever be able to justify that decision of continuing 100% protection onwards, because we have agreed rates that we will work towards. So I think we've done this openly. We've engaged with everybody that's wanted to have a view. We've always had school representatives at head teacher, at SENCO level, engaged in the working group, reviewing as well and quality assuring, bandings as well. So this is a part of change. Change is difficult. And I know there will always be some winners and losers, which is why we agreed the protection and that protection over 3 years. I still think that's the right approach for us to use. That's my view.
And as much as I, take on board, and as I said, I've been a supporter of what we're trying to deliver in terms of equality and fairness, that isn't what we're challenging here. As you've acknowledged, Andy, your staffing has resulted in delays that has then resulted in information not being addressed or communicated and so on. And ultimately, this has then had an impact on schools. And that was why the request was put forward, because ultimately, schools aren't being funded in a fair, transparent way. So we have children in our schools who have EHCPs that have not been updated and have not been updated for a period of time, and therefore their RAS funding isn't appropriate to those students because those EHCPs haven't been updated. Therefore, the budgets aren't right. So if you're sitting there confidently saying to me that you believe that that is the case, then I'll happily have that discussion with you offline. But I know factually that those EHCPs haven't been updated for a significant number of young people. So if you actually go back to the end user, the children at this, that's the core of what we're talking about, they won't be receiving the funding they're entitled to because their EHCPs haven't been updated. So therefore the budgets aren't right. Or do you believe that not to be true?
Yeah, I'll tell you. The updating of EHCPs is a really fair point. Annual reviews are not where they need to be. That's partly because of the responsibility of the council. That's partly because of the responsibility of schools who are responsible to lead that annual review. There are annual reviews out there I've read that are woefully out of date. That's really concerning. That's something we're obviously addressing. If any school has feels the need to review an amount of money that's allocated through the RAS, there's an approach to go. There was one bit of miscommunication which we dealt with really quickly. All of the staff are crystal clear where we are. We're actively promoting that people should appeal if they believe there is a justifiable appeal. That's what we're doing. I chaired a panel last week where we looked at 2 RAS appeals, and I made a really clear decision because there was new information available. That was really straightforward. We're not trying to hide the review process at all, or the appeal process. We're actively pushing it. There was one bit of miscommunication that we dealt with really quickly.
But isn't that then shifted the onus back onto the schools? Because if the school is completing the annual review or has completed the annual review, the local authority hasn't updated that document, and then you're then asking the schools to appeal. So it almost feels like the school is being penalised for the local authority not updating the EHCP.
I think that particular issue where an annual review has been updated, we will obviously be determining the funding on an updated reviewed plan once it's all agreed. Yeah. If anybody is using previous ones, we're not going to do that. That's the wrong approach completely. That's why there's an appeal process. So if a banding had been agreed at X level, we've subsequently put a load more information into the HCP that demonstrates a much higher level of need. Of course, we would need to reflect that in the RAS banding. That's what that appeal process will do, and that's what we will do as we go through those annual reviews as they're completed to make sure we're looking at the most up-to-date review of children. That also means sometimes coming down. That's not just about things always going up. That's also about reviewing some. Obviously, if we put the right provision in, you'd like to think that needs are being met, that sometimes needs do come down. There isn't the need for that higher level of intervention. No, that doesn't always happen. That's the process we need to do. I don't see that there is a massive cohort of young people where we are applying a RAS banding to a really out-of-date EHCP. If there is, there's a process to review, to appeal and review that. That's why we built that safety net in.
Okay. Okay, so I'll move on. In terms of the review, can we just understand a little bit more around that? So there are going to be two reviews taking place. One of the first one, the second review, targeted funding, and then there's going to be a review of the RAS band. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Okay.
Would you like me to just?
Andy, do you want me to come in on?
Yeah, sorry, man.
Yeah.
Just quickly around targeted SEND funding. Again, I feel like I'm stealing half of my update for a later agenda item, but I think it's important now. We have to review every bit of our DSG because we are so significantly overspent. We have to do that. That's our statutory responsibility. Targeted SEND is non-statutory. So we have to review it as part of that process of reviewing every bit of expenditure that we have. What we will do is review that with everybody. We will not sit alone. And we will not make decisions in an office that purely based on a spreadsheet. We will make needs based on how we best meet children's needs. But we have to review that as we have to review every other element of our DSG. Because at the moment, we've shared the forecast here before. If we do nothing, that overspend doesn't sit at 19. That goes up and up and up and up and up. So we have to do something to try and meet the needs of children that are within West Northampton, but also live within our means. That's our job. So targeted SEND has to be a big part of that. We're currently spending £3.5 million plus. We need to demonstrate and understand the impact of that and how it could be used better to meet needs. That's what we need to do. So that's something we have to do from an ESFA point of view. We have to do it from our point of view to assure ourselves that we are using that money in its best possible way to try and meet needs as quickly as we can.
Could I respond, Chair, with regards to it's fine, the RAS band appeals review, just to clarify a couple of points.
Yeah.
One of the things which was raised by yourself and Vice Chair at the pre-meeting was a deeper dive into this information around the review. And there are two parts to that. One is quantitative, one is qualitative. So from a quantitative perspective, we have made the commitment that we will look at doing this on a regular basis, but let's start with the first one. So in the next half term, we'll be able to provide a review, which is looking at the year groups. Is there anything to understand from there? For particularly, there are very, very few appeals coming from secondary schools, just as one point. Looking at the average change in the RAS bands, which is looking at the moment on the first view, just over one RAS band. We're not talking about a £12,000 change. We're talking about, I think it's 1.2, 1.3. That type of level of detail. But also from a qualitative perspective, it's really important, as Dan says, that we ask for the right evidence. The actual appeals form is called a RAS evidence of change form. So we need to ensure that we are making it clear what evidence we are requesting. And also then looking at, from our officers' perspective, what has been their experience, because what we don't want to have is that they're just pushing things back, saying, we didn't get this, didn't get that. Because there's another element then of training and sharing with the guidance notes of what do we need to ensure that that appeal is reviewed quickly once we're up to full strength and correctly. So there are two parts to that. For both of these, there are no timelines at this moment in time. The targeted SEND funding appeal was shared with schools via Head West, and it was a note to say it will come. And at some stage, Louisa will be able to create a timeline. And as Ben said, it doesn't just involve West Northampton staff, and includes, we're requesting members from different types of settings, mainstream, academy, etc., but also the input yet again from WMVP. And it's the same with the RAS band appeals, the process. Today is only the second time we've spoken about this. The first time I mentioned it was at the training. The scope of this review has not yet been defined. What I've done today is just brought to forum the fact that we are looking at something. We'd look at the learnings we've had over the last number of months, because we believe it's the right thing to do looking forward. Thank you.
So
Dan,
just
is there any
to
other?
clarify, the modelling will be presented to schools so that they have greater support in terms of processing appeals. Is that what was just said?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And then just the final question then, I'm sure we'll all be relieved to know. At the moment, how confident are you that schools are accurately aware of the funding that they will have to support their budget setting for next financial year?
All schools have received so far 3 funding statements. The accuracy of those statements has increased with each one. When I've seen any of the challenges, it's around generally 1 or 2 young people. Either the school doesn't have that young person anymore as part of their cohort, or we're missing somebody. So this has been reviewed on a regular basis. Having said that, then, I personally have a very high accuracy that across the piece, there will be many schools have already got where there's no queries, will already have the details that they need, and that the schools which don't, where there are still some queries, and I can't quantify the number of schools, Beth's not here today, and we're just reviewing this. I do believe it's a small number of schools. So personally, I have a high percentage accuracy that schools can. That's my opinion.
Okay. Before I ask if there's any more questions, I think it's important to say this change that we've gone through was always going to be a big change. I think we're about 3,500 odd or more plans that are fitted into the RAS banding now. So it's always going to be difficult, and it's always going to have a degree of varying results as you work your way through. I think part of the work that Andy and the team will do, which is to look back at lessons learned as well, particularly in relation as you go forward with the post-16 funding, will be important to see what we can learn and what's worked well and what hasn't. I think the issues which we've talked about today are probably around staffing and not having enough staffing, and perhaps some of the information that they were, or the training they had, or the information that they were interpreting out has led to missed messages, as we have found in the sector, which hopefully is corrected now. And I think that one of the things I think will give everyone a high degree of confidence as well is if we can, as part of this initial feedback, and also feed that into the reviews that we do, have a high quality customer service feedback, so that schools individually can show how it's reflected into from their lens, and come that to forum with that, so that we've then got a complete picture. Will also help the review process, and I think the review process is very important to look at whether the banding meets the needs, which there's no reason to believe it won't, but you're doing that process, and make sure that the appeals process is an efficient and effective one, as again you are doing. So if those are the comments I'd have, Andy.
Can I also add, I think, there are some real positives in the fact that schools now have one caseworker to approach. And I think that's been, I know from the sector, talking to people, having that one person to go to has really helped. Having the SEN teachers coming in, working alongside schools, that has really enabled schools as well. So there's some real positives that I think should be reflected as well as part of the process.
Can I add one other point, Chair? The review that we're going through, and the review we're looking at the RASMAN appeals process primarily, but it gives us the opportunity to look at other lessons learned. We're actually working with Imosphere Limited, who are the proprietary owner of the system. And as part of that review, we're looking at benchmarking against where we are with all other local authorities using the same system. And that's already set up for March. So that's again part of the review. So we're not just looking at West Northants, we're looking at comparisons to other local authorities. I'm not sure I've mentioned that before, but I just wanted to add that.
No, thank you. Ben.
Just to follow on from that bit really quickly, and again, I'm stealing my own thunder from later on the agenda. We've employed a consultant that's working with us to develop our deficit management plan, our DSG deficit management plan. She's worked with half a dozen authorities that are either in delivering better value or safety valve. She is currently writing a report of the thematic analysis of the councils that get themselves into that situation and what works getting out of that situation. I spent with Louisa actually, for the first time, the three of us spent a couple of hours yesterday going through almost line by line of all of our DSG, of some benchmarking, etc. All of this RAS work that consultant is looking at and benchmarking against other places that have done similar things. So we are making sure we're learning from not just those using Imosphere, but up and down the country. I certainly don't want us to be in that delivering better value safety valve world. If we are, we lose control of a lot of our decision making. And then we are just purely making decisions around money, not around children. That is not where we want to be at all. So we're trying to move quickly to avoid escalating into that world. And I'll bring that update and I'll bring that plan here at our next meeting in May. Okay. Sorry,
Okay.
no, that's
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. If there's no further questions, then I think we're happy to note the report and move on to the next agenda item, which is the DSG monitoring. Wendy.
Yep, so the paper outlines the forecast outturn for the 24-25 financial year as at period 9 or December, and the movement from the prior reported position, which was based on period 7 or October. So the current forecast outturn across the DSG is an overspend of 12.8 million. So there's been an adverse movement overall of about 332,000 from the prior position. Within this, the high needs block has worsened by 384,000, which is largely driven by increased costs of independent placement costs. So firstly, due to the part-year impact of a new speech and language therapy contract, and secondly, as a result of a prior year under-accrual for joint funded placements with social care, which came in higher than the costs that were accounted for at the end of the prior financial year. So the total forecast overspend in the high needs block now totals 13.2 million. Approximately 6 million of that is due to prior year demand above the increased funding levels that we received, and the rest is due to in-year growth and demand in placements. So the main areas of pressure are provision for pupils with SEN in local schools, which totals about 6 million of the total overspend, independent and out of area placements, which totals 2.2 million, and alternative provision, which totals 3.7 million. There's very negligible movement across the other blocks this month. However, there is a risk, just to flag, in early years due to some funding in relation to the new working 2-year-old entitlement, that the funding that we receive from central government will be less than what's been paid out. However, the service are currently working with the DFE to mitigate that risk. So that pretty much covers the key points in the paper if anyone's got any questions.
Board members, any questions? Emily? Dan?
Sorry, Emily, I don't know if you have this information to hand. Year on year, we've seen an increase in costs for out of authority provision, independent provision. Do you know how much that's gone up on previous year?
Yeah, so actually the growth in independent and out of area placements, the year on year increase in the overspend that we're seeing has reduced from the prior year. So it's slowing down. I haven't got the exact figures to hand, but the trend is certainly that we have seen increases year on year in independent and out of area placement costs. But as I say, that sort of increase year on year has slowed down this year. So it has still gone up, but it's less so than in prior years. So we can perhaps bring that for the final outturn, just sort of like a graph or a
It was
chart
just
to
something
show.
that Ben and I had discussed in previous meetings that over time, we would see a
Yeah.
slowing trend, and it was just interesting to see where we were at this point in terms of percentage. Obviously, it will take time, won't it? But
Yeah, no,
it's good to see
most
that that's obviously
definitely.
the case it's coming that way.
Yeah, most definitely. So yeah, that's exactly sort of part of some of the things that we're looking at as part of the deficit management plan, and it's stuff that we've spoken about here before around obviously the capital programme where we're increasing provision in local schools, but it's also linked to the sort of government announcements that they've put out there so far around increasing inclusion as well in mainstream schools, for which they announced some additional capital funding in December. So we're still waiting to see the details of what that means for us. But yeah, certainly it looks like it's starting to have an impact, but it's obviously very early days as we've had sort of the main sort of bulk of provision come online and still more to come going forwards.
Emily said everything I wanted to say, but she said it much more articulately, I think. The only other thing I wanted to quickly raise around out-of-county schools. So real concern, again, really high cost area. I believe if we're having to go out of county, that means we haven't got the right provision locally. So we're learning from that. To show the rigor that we're taking, we've instructed our internal audit team to go and audit exactly that cost centre and understand what, how, why, where, and do some benchmarking around costs there. That report will come back to us. We will then obviously take that forward to make sure we're learning from that. And I'm working with my counterparts across the East Midlands. Again, and I'll touch on this slightly later again on the agenda, but one of the big directions coming out of the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill is around really reducing the ability for private organisations to make profit on children's placements, whether that be social care or education placements. So we're looking at doing some benchmarking regionally and really capping some of the costs on those incredibly expensive placements. So I'll do a little bit more on that later, but I think Emily's absolutely right. And we can do a quick summary of that at the end of this financial year as well, to look at the overall costs and the numbers as well.
I think that would be helpful. Dan?
Sorry, just on that, Ben, I know obviously, we are here to talk about kind of from a financial perspective, but it's important to kind of look at value for money, isn't it, for those young people in terms of meeting need? Will the authority be, as part of that auditing process, be engaging with those external providers out of local authority to ensure young people are getting what they need ultimately?
Thank you. Are there any more questions for Emily? No? Okay. Ben, would you like to...
Dovetailing everything here, and I keep stealing my own thunder. I'm going to let Emily go first and steal all the thunder first. If that's all right.
Okay.
Do a bit of a double act
Okay,
today.
fine.
Yeah. So the paper that we've got here outlines the DSG funding settlement for 25-26. And so as everybody knows, usually the DfE publish provisional allocations for the DSG for the following financial year in July, but that was delayed this year because of the general election and the new government. So we did receive a policy note in the autumn to help with the planning and consultation that we did throughout the month of November. And this largely confirmed no changes to the structure of the national funding formula, with the exception of some tweaks around PFI and split site funding as well. So at the end of October, the Chancellor announced the government's budget for 25-26, which included a 2.3 billion national increase for schools, with 1 billion of that for high needs funding. So for comparison, the current year was the final year of a 4.7 billion increase over 3 years to the national schools budget, which was then uplifted by 2 billion in each of the current financial year and prior financial year. So for 24-25 in totality, schools funding saw an increase of nearly 4 billion, with 0.5 billion of that for high needs. So the government's announcements have also confirmed that outside of the national funding formula, there'll be a separate grant around meeting the increase in employers' national insurance contributions as well, which result from the changes to national insurance. The table within the report under section 2.7 details the WNC final DSG allocations, which were published in December. So for schools, the comparison is made a bit more tricky because the government have rolled in a number of grants that have been received separately for this financial year. They've rolled that into the national funding formula for next financial year. So we've had to re-baseline the current year allocation so that we can do a like for like or near enough like for like increase. So the increase in the schools block funding for West Northants is 7.6 million, which equates to 2%. So nationally, on average, the funding has increased through the national funding formula by 2.3%. So it's quite a challenging settlement for schools and West Northants schools in particular. So Appendix A to the report details some draft schools budgets, which will be published before the end of February, as usual, once the DfE sign off the submission that we made in mid-January of the authority pro forma tool. So moving on to the high needs block. So the West Northants high needs block. So whilst for the schools block, the separate grants were rolled into the national funding formula, for the high needs block, the grants haven't been rolled in. So we're still awaiting to hear further information about those separate grants that haven't been rolled in. But in terms of the national funding formula, West Northants has seen an increase in high needs block funding of 5.5 million, which is an increase of 7.5%. So West Northants remain in the bottom quartile in terms of the high needs funding per pupil that we receive, and the increases through the national funding formula nationally, 7% was the minimum uplift and 10% was the ceiling. So again, we're at the bottom end of the increases that local authorities are seeing through that. So obviously, whilst high needs funding has doubled nationally, 1 billion only represents about a quarter of the estimated national deficit. And essentially, that increase is at the expense of the schools' budgets, as it's part of sort of the wider increase to the core schools' budgets. So as we've seen with current and prior years, the uplift isn't sufficient to meet the structural deficit that we have in the budget, let alone growth in demand, complexity, and inflationary increases as well. So there is obviously in place a statutory override currently, which allows us to ring fence our high needs block deficits away from our council's general fund balances, and that is due to end in March 26. As part of the local government provisional settlement in December, it was fairly silent on an extension to that statutory override. But it did outline that the government intends to set out plans for reforming the SEND system in further detail, and we're expecting those details anytime now. So that was around sort of how the government's going to support local authority to deal with historic and accruing deficits, and any transition period from the current system to the reformed system, and then informing any decision to remove or extend the statutory override as well. So early years block, the increase that we're seeing in West Northants is largely due to the expansion of the rollout of new entitlements, which is based on forecast take-up. The settlement and the policy note that was published in the autumn also outlined essentially the unwinding of central expenditure. So as we know, in prior years, we've been able to take up to 5%, but that's reduced to 4% for 25-26, and it's reducing further to 3% in the following year as well. And finally, the central school services block. So again, as expected, we've seen an overall decrease in the funding that we receive through that block because the historical element of that block is being unwound each year by a 20% reduction. So the services that are funded by the central schools services block have had gradually had their costs moved to the general fund, and that's been built into the medium term general fund revenue plan as well. So that basically outlines the key parts from the autumn budget and December settlement.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. I thought the paper was very clear paper. Thank you very much for that. I thought it's a very dismal picture. The the percentage increase in funding, as we know, as is highlighted here, is 2%. I was on holiday the last couple of days, but I took the opportunity of taking with me the full report on the teachers' pay review recommendations from the government and read it. And it recognises there that they would prefer, which union colleagues may or may not be happy with, a 2.8% increase. And we can expect, I would expect something at least similar, if not more, for support staff, particularly where the lower grades are. So the bottom line is we would have received 2%. We're transferring 0.5% to high needs, so we won't be receiving 2%. And there's at best a 2.8% and could be higher pay award, which we've expected to be met out of efficiencies, which are clearly stated in the government's representations to the pay review board, and have also said there won't be any more money. So there's going to be more pressure. There's going to be a lot more pressure on schools in the coming year. Am I right in saying, Emily, the government have said they will fund the national insurance contributions, but we haven't yet heard how or by how much?
That's right, yeah. So we were expecting to receive a separate sort of allocation on what that funding might be. So for the local government final settlement, which was yesterday, we received information on how much we're going to get to cover national insurance increases as part of that. So I'm expecting something similar for the schools' national insurance as well. How they're going to calculate what that figure is, I don't know. I think for local government, they've taken sort of staff costs off of various sort of statutory returns that we've got to submit. We'll wait to hear further information on that. Of course, I think that's only going to cover staff increases, potentially not increases, for example, to cover increases in rates for independent providers as well, who may come forwards.
So again, if it's not covering those independent providers, early years is going to find an already diminishing funding stream harder to deal with, and schools will be faced, and no doubt already are, with your budget setting, with challenges again this year. So maintaining the quality of education and providing for the needs of the children is obviously going to be tough yet again in this budget round. But that's where we are. The one question I have got is, we talked about the high needs and we talked about being in the lower quartile. Do we know why that is the case, why we're in the low quartile?
There's obviously an element of the funding formula which is based on historical data, and then the rest of it is obviously just formula sort of through the DFE sausage machine for the high needs block. So we could look into more detail around potentially why that is. It could be that there's a lag in some of the data that they're using, but we could certainly look into that.
I think it would be worth it. I think it'd be worthwhile, because we have said this for certainly the last 5 years, to my knowledge, and you would hope that any historical issues had rolled out would start to roll out and see the funding be a bit more
Yeah.
proportionate perhaps to the need.
It's a very small amount of the formula, but it's certainly a factor within it. But you do see sort of some local authorities that haven't got as big deficits in their DSG or even are in surplus. Luckily enough, some of those inexplicably receive up to the maximum level of funding through the national funding formula. So it's potentially a question around sort of fairness in the formula as well.
Ben.
If I just come back to those couple of bits, and I've got a few other updates after Emily. Wanted Emily to do the detail first, but if I can do those shortly. I definitely think we need to look at the formula and the way that it is generated. Emily's absolutely right. Some of it is about historical numbers. In West Northampton, we are well below national average in terms of SEND support, in terms of the identification. And historically, we have been quite a way below in terms of our proportion of children with additional needs and low in terms of other vulnerabilities as well. So some of that obviously plays into the overall funding allocation that we get. Where we are seen as a local authority nationally from a funding point of view, we are seen as a very affluent local authority. What happens is the affluence and the challenge between the top end and the bottom end of the scale is really extreme in West Northampton. Sadly, the middle looks actually quite okay, and that's what it's all done as an average. Fiona and I, we've mentioned that lots of times here. We've raised that through the F40 group, through LGA, through other channels, and we'll keep doing that. So I do think there's the exercise to look into what could we do to look at how we generate more money coming into the system. I think that is really important for us to do. Just to say around the one way that this does move quickly is our EHCP numbers. So we've gone from about 1,600 3 years ago when West Northampton, or nearly 4 years ago now when West Northampton was created. There are now about 4,100 and there's nearly 1,000 in process of being assessed. That is ridiculously high. It should not be that level at all. So we've got to do something about that. The numbers coming through are far, far higher than our statutory neighbours, our geographical neighbours as well. So there's a lot of this we need to look at. That's what new colleagues we've already mentioned a few times will be really getting their teeth into as we do that. So I think that was just a quick comment on the back of Emily's, but happy to stop. There's a couple of other bits I just wanted to update on the sort of the wider picture where I think things are going on a national level. But I don't know if there's any more comments or questions from Emily's report.
One quick question from me, just going back to the, it's nice to hear that there's going to be some support with the employer's national insurance. Does that extend to maintain nursery schools as well, do you know?
I assume so, yeah.
Yep, please do. Thanks.
So the reason I wanted Emily to go first, I think I agree. I think that's a really detailed paper. There's a lot in there, and I think that's very helpful. Some other bits, not specifically about the budget, but about some of the national changes that are happening that I think we all need to be aware of, and I'm sure everyone in the room is. So there's three key things for me in that. First is last year, I've talked about this briefly, ISOS produced their big report into reviewing the SEND system 10 years on from the reforms. I think a really, really good report. Really clear recommendations in there, and those recommendations, I'm happy to talk to anyone outside of here about it. It's a very long report. I'm like you, Paul, I took it on holiday with me. I'm really sad. Couple of things that they recommend in there. Firstly, top-down reform is the only way to solve the SEND crisis, and it is a crisis nationally. The current system has created adversarial relationships between schools, local authorities, health colleagues, social care, but primarily with parents. So the system that was designed to improve outcomes has actually led to worse educational outcomes for children with additional needs and has created a battle between everybody involved. And Emily's already mentioned 5 billion is the shortfall at the moment. That can never be resolved from a bottom-up approach. It's not possible at all. So I think those recommendations are really, really helpful. And the evidence base behind them is crystal clear. What that then led to is the Education Select Committee have called for evidence and called for responses around how to solve the SEND crisis. So cross-party committee looking at we have to do something different for some of our most vulnerable children. What can we do? So they are currently gathering that evidence. I think that's the right approach. I'm really hopeful that will lead to either changes in legislation or policy coming soon, specifically about SEND. And then the last bit of that, which I think briefly touched on as well, we've finally got some detail about the Children's Wellbeing in Schools bill. So we've got the policy detail has now come out from the discussions in Parliament. I think it came out at the beginning of last week. Again, really heavy, lots and lots of detail, lots of change proposed, which is great. A couple of the really key bits in there. I think someone mentioned it earlier. I think Andy or Emily might have mentioned it earlier. Huge drive from the Department for Education now that we will not be building lots more special schools. There is an expectation that mainstream schools meet the needs of children that live in their area. Our response already to the DfE has been, yeah, that's great. Really like that. Okay, where are all the specialist staff coming from, and where's all the training, and where's the funding to enable that? Because what we need is those specialist people leading those units in mainstream. You know, and Shazia and I have talked a lot about this. We can build new buildings. That's actually relatively straightforward. Then equipping them with the right people that will really drive up standards and lead to improved outcomes. That is a lot more complex. There's some other key bits around that legislation, I feel, for education specifically. There's lots more around social care. So lots around, for the first time in a generation now, local authorities will be able to open new schools. They won't automatically be academies. There's not going to be forced academisation at all. And actually academies can come back under local authority control. I see that as a real positive. I probably would say that, wouldn't I? There's also being proposed a lot more legal powers around local authorities directing all schools, whether that be around admitting children with EHCPs or around fair access. Again, I think that is really positive. I don't want us to get to the end of the line where we have to start directing people, because I want us to agree things in the round. And actually, it's worst time for Katie to leave in a way, because I'll ask Katie to talk about FAP, but we can do that another time, or Shazia can. So I think there's some really good news coming at the moment. At the moment, it's up there talk. We need the detail of how it's actually going to be implemented and what it really means for us. I will keep bringing updates through this group, because I think it could be really important, and there could be some real opportunities for us as well. The last really quick thing I just wanted to mention was actually the capital side. So one of the big announcements that was made was that there would be £740 million extra made nationally for local authorities to work with local schools, etc., to create more mainstream places for children with SEND. We don't know exactly what our part of that allocation will look like. We can work it out on a formulaic level, but I don't want to throw figures around because they could be wrong. We should get more of that information over the coming months. Shaz is going to a briefing with the DfE in about 3 or 4 weeks' time to get a bit more clarity about that. What we are doing to try and get ahead of the game there, we're meeting next week with a group of architects that have been recognised nationally and internationally, who are designing schools in other countries where every school must be built to accommodate children with additional needs. So looking at that really basic design for any expansions of schools, any new schools, any new units that we might build, and trying to learn from that really good practice internationally and nationally as well. And we'll bring that learning into our for about how we design things going forwards. That's what I believe will really start to drive down some of those big out-of-county costs and those independent costs that we touched on briefly earlier. That's where we're going to start to make the difference. So I just wanted to share some of those sort of policy updates that are coming. As I said, I think for all of us, there will be some real opportunities that we could seize here, particularly around jumping on some of the capital programme. Shazia and I have already met with the DfE and said we are ready to go, because we know where the demand is and we know the schools that are interested, and we've got models that we know work from a commissioning perspective as well. So I'll keep bringing that through here, and obviously I'm happy to talk to anyone outside of here as well. That's okay.
Thank you, Ben. Are there any other questions for Emily or Ben? No? Okay, thank you. Thanks very much for that picture there. Shall we move on to the...
Chair, happy to. So committed to bringing an update to this meeting. I've already slightly mentioned that I'll bring a report to the next meeting in May around our deficit management plan. And I know it's a little bit of semantics, but I need to remind myself of it regularly. We are not talking about a recovery plan. We're talking about managing our deficit in DSG at the moment and our high needs. So the key things that we're doing there, I've already talked briefly in here around the control internally. So that's all the RAS updates we've talked about already, having clarity about how we assess need and how we allocate funding. We have a new funding panel, which again I've mentioned here before, but just for clarity for everyone. So currently chaired by the Director of Children's Services or myself. I will take that chairing on from March onwards. We have 12 SENCOs who have volunteered to be a part of that group to provide challenge to applications coming through, to advice about whether the decisions around whether we're agreeing, what we're agreeing, the provisions are appropriate, but then also taking that learning back and feeding it back through our SENCO network to try and drive up the quality of applications and requests as well. And through speaking with our parent forum, who are there as observers as well, and our SENCO network and members of that panel, we've agreed, and Chair, I know I've spoken to you already, that member of the school forum will come and review or observe that panel on either a half-termly or termly basis, just to get that assurance around the rigour of that decision-making and around how we're tracking and forecasting funding on there. We will put training on for all of those people the week after half-term, and start bringing those colleagues in from early March onwards. So that's one of the things within our management plan. The other key bits we've touched on a few times already today. So bringing in new leaders and managers, which enables staff on the ground to be empowered to do the job on the ground with the right direction, but now enables us to look up and start looking forward. So some of the longer term planning that, for example, Shazia does around sufficiency of all places, we are now really able to get into the detail and do that sufficiency of additional needs places. So I believe that work will really start to drive the clarity of what we know we need in terms of those specialist places going forwards, but also what we need to design, as I just mentioned, around designing those new builds and those new units in mainstream. That's where we're really going to start to bring that some of those big costs down. And another really key element of that is our alternative provision. At the moment, our alternative provision sector is full of children with EHCPs who can't move anywhere else. So when it comes to us using alternative provision for that reasonably quick turnaround, support a young person and then manage a really successful transition back into mainstream, at the moment, we're struggling to get children in, let alone get them back out again. So all of that work will really help us have, or ensure ourselves that we have the right system to meet the needs that we know we have coming forwards. And those needs, we've got a pretty good idea about where children obviously live. And we know about things like birth rates, how that will influence us, but we're also getting much greater detail around the primary, secondary, tertiary needs of children so we can design the right provisions. So that all of that is going to really help bring that or manage that DSG deficit. And the last bit, which is the really dry stuff, but it's really important, is our external colleague is working really closely with internal finance colleagues, with service leads across all of our services to review line by line of our DSG to make sure we are including everything in the right places, to do that benchmarking to other local authority areas. And as I said earlier, to really learn from authorities that have gone way too far into that DBV or safety valve world. That's going to influence exactly how we push that deficit management plan forward. We will bring the first draft of that plan here in May for everybody around this table to comment on, and then we will have to have very regular meetings with the ESFA to assure them that we are doing everything that we need to do locally. But I feel like we're in the right place now to do that. We've got the right people and the right view of what needs to be done. So happy to take any comments, questions about it. Chair, I know you've been involved in things like this through your other work as well, so I'm more than happy to talk to you outside of here about that.
Yeah, no, what Ben's referring to as school resource management advisor. I've worked with other colleagues and local authorities that have gone into the safety valve, and Ben's quite right. You lose complete autonomy over the decisions you make, and generally speaking, the ones that I've seen, the child is the very last consideration and not the first consideration ever. And some of the decisions I've seen have been extraordinarily arbitrary. Are there any questions for Ben around this deficit recovery? No? Okay, I would look forward to seeing that report in May. High needs, no, we've done the high, early years. Yeah. Oh, sorry, high needs budget proposals.
I think that's me again.
Yeah.
So the paper is for information, and it is just to inform the schools forum of the high needs places that are set for next financial year, the indicative special school budgets, and the RAS rates for 25-26 as well, which are detailed in the 3 appendices to the reports. And then we've just got an update on the overall high needs budget set in progress for 25-26 as well. So on an annual basis, the local authority have to submit places to the ESFA in November to determine recoupment. And at the same time, West Northants complete places for maintained providers as well. So places form approximately half of the special schools budgets. That is essentially the fixed element of the budget. And on top of that, top up is received separately based on the RAS. And the budget for this has been determined using the autumn update to provide indicative figures. They're indicative because obviously they're subject to change based on individual pupils. So as I said, those 2 items are detailed in appendices A and C to the report, and it forms part of the wider high needs budget setting. So if I just recap on the in-year position on the high needs block. So as at period 9, we're forecasting an overspend of 13.2 million, which obviously requires the completion of the DSG management plan. The majority of other councils are obviously facing similar high needs pressures, and we're working alongside other authorities to research best practice and manage demand. The 25-26 budget setting process included a review of the existing budgets, issues and risks that have been identified since the setting of the budgets, and opportunities within the current year position to give a baseline prior to then looking at estimated growth requirements, inflation, and any savings and efficiencies. So to be clear, the current savings that have been identified, which are very modest, aren't predicated on cuts to services. They're more around efficiencies. So the savings that have been identified as part of next year's budget total 0.5 million. In line with the in-year position on the overspend, the structural deficit, which is essentially our 1st of April position, so the full year effect of all of this year's current demand, that is 14.8 million. On top of that, we've got growth in inflation based on growth in EHCPs and demand and complexity, and that totals 7 million. So the cost pressures represent an increase in the level of support and services provided. All of that essentially, as the table outlines within the report, results in an estimated cost of provision that totals 18.9 million, more than the net budget of 60 million. So that is essentially the net budget, which has been reduced by recoupment, but then we've also factored in, on top of the high needs block funding, the transfer from the schools block as well, which gives that funding figure. So that essentially is the sort of overspend that we're predicting on day 1, as Ben referenced earlier, and the development of the deficit management plan will be looking to reduce that deficit position over next financial year and obviously the medium term as well. So the picture sort of without doing anything is that we'll be essentially seeing our cumulative deficit rising exponentially, because we'll have obviously the impact of the growth and demand that we've built up, which is essentially doubling year on year, on top of the in-year growth and demand, which is around the £6-7 million mark year on year. So that's where we're at with the high needs budget.
Okay, thank you. The on 3.3, the special schools rate, I write in reading that the funding rates for special schools have not increased, so they're staying the same for 25, 26 as 24, 25.
I think that's the position at the moment, but I think there are internal discussions going on at the moment around that.
Yeah, because they'll have, I mean, it's the increase in support staff pay across the years, and they're heavily reliant on that in most special schools.
Yeah.
That would have quite an effect on their financial viability, and particularly as you're opening a new one in September. Okay, are there any questions for members on the? No? Okay. Thank you, Emily. Should we look at early years? Thanks.
So in terms of the papers that have been circulated, it's really just that we're bringing a paper for information to Schools Forum. In December 2024 Schools Forum, we discussed the kind of proposals and the approach we intended on using as part of the modelling exercise for the proposed rates for 25-26. So this paper kind of outlines the agreed rates based on the modelling work that's been undertaken. Just to go through really that the new rates are outlined in table 2, that for the 3 and 4 year old universal rate, we are proposing £5.05. Deprivation stays the same as 0.32 pence. 2-year-old disadvantage rate and the 2-year-old working rate remains the same at £7.22. The under 2 rates for working families is £10.57. No change to targeted SEND funding at £10. Early years pupil premium has increased nationally to £1, and Disability Access Fund also increased nationally to £9.38. I wonder if at this point it's worth saying that as agreed at the last Schools Forum, we agreed that we'd work with School Forum members, particularly the early years sector, to kind of discuss how the modelling work was undertaken, and a meeting took place on the 31st of Jan, and they've kindly joined us. We had Louise and Rachel was not able to attend, but we were able to circulate the kind of slides, and it was a really positive meeting to look at how the modelling work takes place, and finance colleagues kind of went through the intricacies of how we use full year allocations and take up data to inform the modelling process, and why the FE published rates aren't exactly what West Northants can fund to provide us, and that was a really useful exercise. Ben, can I bring it, Glenn?
Yeah, Chair, just to add to that, exactly as Ray said, so we met on Friday afternoon. We opened that meeting up. Bev, Louise, Rachel was pretending to be off sick. I'm just seeing if she is online, and there she is. I just seen she's.
I am here.
No, Rachel really wasn't very well, but we kept Rachel in the loop. We've sent her all of the comments, etc. as well. A lot of that meeting was us providing updates about what some of the behind the scenes stuff that we don't really talk about, and obviously how we receive our funding and then how we dish it out, etc. Personally, I found it really useful because I felt I learned loads. I learned loads from the questions that Bev and colleagues raised and the perspective, but also the feedback. And Bev, I don't know if I'll ask you to comment in a minute, and you do or don't, but what we tried to do is really break down the way we receive our funding, how we then use that funding to meet the specific requirements of it, but then go into loads more detail around that bit that we do centrally retain, what that actually does. And I personally thought that was a really helpful exercise. The feedback that we had was really positive. The big outcome for me from that meeting is I felt we all left there with a greater understanding of exactly where we are and what we can and what we can't do. But what we agreed is to some joint communication out to the wider early years sector. So jointly, we volunteered Rachel at this point, doing a nice video, going on and putting herself up front and speaking about all the detail. We didn't quite do it. We've got, Rayhana and colleagues run really regular sort of workshop sessions with all early years providers. We're all going to go to that next one. On the back of that, we will then produce either a short video or a short update of a presentation with words over the top. We'll send out to everybody in the sector and start to get more and more feedback. I think it's really going to help. The big bit for me was we're going to do that jointly. So we can say, this is where we are, this is what we're trying to do, this is what we're not. And the representatives of the sector in this room and in other groups can then put the provider angle on it as well and talk peer-to-peer with their colleagues. So I thought it was a really useful session, personally. Bev, I don't know if you do.
Yeah, no, it was really useful, and it came about off the back of, with the consultation and the top slice taken by the local authority of the early years funding before it's passed out is always just a percentage. So we wanted to try and put some context to that percentage to help us out on the front line understand why that money can't come through to us. And it was really insightful in that respect. I came away with a better understanding of what their central costs are and statutory obligations as well. I think we found during those conversations that actually it's still very technically worded. So you took on board feedback really positively, I felt, and hopefully now we'll be able to get a communication together so that we can help others in the sector understand exactly why that money is held back centrally. From me, that was the biggest gain, and a couple of selfish questions that I asked too.
One, and Bev, I know we've worked together on lots of different bits before. What I hope colleagues got on Friday, and I hope more of the sector will get, is we will come and explain what we're doing and why we're doing it, but we'll also come and say, and if we're not getting it right, we'll listen. So we had a long conversation about language, and actually the feedback, and it's really straightforward, but sometimes you don't see those bits, do you? A lot of the people that we're communicating with in the early years sector are childminders that are full-time children. We send out really complex things about formulaic things from the DF and all these. Actually, we need to break that down. We need to use the most simple, still accurate and clear, but really simple, straightforward language. That's the thing that I think we can do verbally a lot better sometimes than the way we write it down. Hence that commitment to doing, and I will talk to Rachel and I'll talk to Bev about exactly how we do that. But really breaking down the bits, and where the nub of that conversation got to is, this is what is in our direct control. This is what is not. This is what comes from central government. And if we can just break that down in very layman's terms, I think that will help everybody move forward a lot, because then we know what the bits that are in our gift, don't we? So I see Rachel's hand's gone up.
Yeah, Rachel, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I'm really sorry that I'm not there in person today, and yeah, apologies for missing the meeting. Thank you for recording it for me. It was overall, yeah, really positive. I hate to sort of rain on that parade really, but I think it was mentioned in the meeting on Friday by Bev that we are still facing a cut. And earlier Paul was mentioning about early years having the same difficulties with the national minimum wage increase, and also the national insurance is increasing. So I think it's a bit of a worrying time, because I know Ray and her team have worked really hard to kind of change that, change the relationship between providers and yourselves, and I'm worried that that cut on top of everything else is going to add a ridiculous amount of pressure on early year settings. So I just wanted to comment on that it is, unfortunately, and I appreciate the position that you're all in, we are still facing a cut in financials.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I think we really acutely feel that, particularly around in the early years.
Can I
Bev?
just to know, reading through the report, where you've detailed the cuts and what that means per child across a year is really useful to see. Can we just note that that's in real terms, the cut's greater than that because we haven't seen the increase. So we've lost the increase and then we've had the cut, if that makes sense. So in real terms, you know, the hit's much harder than is detailed, although that's useful. Just wanted to make that comment. And then I have got a couple of other questions, if now's a good time to just raise those. We spoke on Friday, and I think it's important just to bring it to this forum as well. And you mentioned it here in your report that we always receive less funding than the hours that are claimed for because of the way that those numbers are budgeted for with the submissions to the DFE through the census in January. And this is an issue that occurs year on year. It's not an improving situation. And we talked about on Friday being that then that's perhaps not the right measurement. So I just really wanted to make sure that is then being picked up and taken to the DFE and raised. I mean, we can't be the only local authority that sees that.
I mean, Beth's the expert at that part of the question, but what I will say is that it's noted and it is discussions that we've had with DFE. What we're hoping is the way the allocations are going to be done in the future are going to look a little bit differently. At the moment, we've got termly collections and they are saying that that's going to change. So that will help with the improvement of accuracy. Unfortunately, the kind of difference in this spring's kind of take-up data was based on the fact that, and I think I've spoken about it before, that the way our early years portal was set up didn't include the 2-year-old disadvantage portal feeding directly into the early years portal, so that automatically the columns are populated the right way, if that makes sense. And so when submissions were done, as opposed to them being in the 2-year-old working category, they were in the 2-year-old disadvantage. So when we've had to do our modelling work, what we've seen automatically straight away was that there was a reduction in the number of hours that should have been in the working, which then has a direct impact on how allocations are done. But no, it's something that we will continue to have those conversations with DFE, and hopefully for the next returns, it'll be a lot more accurate. And the sector are getting on board, and I feel like we are making that difference. But sometimes it's not their fault. Sometimes it's the system. So it's acknowledging that, really, Beth. Thank you.
With the system, just moving on to that, that headcount system specifically, it's been a huge issue, probably taking 3 times the normal amount of time for a provider to complete at the start of January. And I know and I appreciate this isn't your software, this is software that you buy in, and therefore your hands are quite tied. Is there anything that you can do as a local authority to mitigate against that happening again? It was a massive hit to us, cost to resource, and also mental health as well of our administrators.
I mean, all we can say is that whatever amendments or fixes that were put in January, February submission has been without any issues. So we're hoping that whatever Capita did through the system has actually resolved the issue. So we're hoping that that doesn't happen again. However, like I say with a caveat, unfortunately, some of that is not in my control. And when the updates are done to get ready for the next kind of expansion programs, we just get the instructions and we're rolling out those instructions, but we don't have the kind of detail behind it. So it is something that we're having relevant conversations with Capita and our IT department.
If I could, I think one response to that is, if there are issues in the functionality of that system, our strength is doing that together. So if we're going to speak to Capita about it, what I'd love to do is sit with you and Rachel and other colleagues, and we can feed back from our perspective, this is why it's not working for us.
Yeah.
You can feed it back from your perspective. It's in Capita's interest to make this work. They're a commercial organisation. They provide the software we use at the moment. So I think if we join forces and provide that challenge back, we're more likely to influence some change, aren't we?
Well, I don't really have any other information besides the fact that the rest of it is just literally a summary of the kind of rates, but we intend to cascade that information in terms of comms out to the sector this week. And we'll follow up with sharing the coffee and catch within our coffee and catch up either next week, Wednesday, or reschedule a specific date to discuss the kind of rates and the modelling work. And then for the future, we intend to have those pre-meetings as part of the modelling work for the following years, early years rates formulation.
Super, thank you. Are there any more questions? Oh, Rachel, have you still got your hand up?
Yeah, sorry, I did put it down. I put it back up again. Without sort of repeating myself, I know I've sent Ray and Ben some comments to the meeting on Friday. But am I right in thinking, Ray, that there are some purchasable updates on Capita that make it an easier system?
Yes, you are. And one of them we have purchased, which is the 2-year-old portal. So that citizens portal will make things a lot more efficient for us, because actually where providers are having to do almost double checking on 2-year-old disadvantage codes, it will mean that parents are when they actually receive their offer letter from the system, it's directly through HMRC and DWP. So that code will feed into the early years portal so that it's all relevant, as opposed to the provider having to double check. It reduces the administration for providers for 2-year-old disadvantaged children, as well as our audit checks that we won't have to do, because we know that we won't have to claw back, because those will be children that are eligible. So that's something that we've actually brought in, and the implementation, we're working on testing at the moment and implementing from April.
Lovely. I know there's a colleague that does attend the coffee and catch-up sessions that works in another, I think it's Milton Keynes, use the same portal system, and I'm sure it was her that was saying that there's some that theirs works really efficiently, so maybe working with partners across into another county to try and support our system.
Definitely, and I think, if I'm really honest, most local authorities have that embedded within our system, and that was one of the things that I was really keen on having, because it should be smooth, accessible for parents, as well as providers. And hopefully, as part of the second phase, we'll be doing assisted applications, so we'll be training Family Hub staff to be able to use it so that parents can get the assistance, those that are entitled to 2-year-old disadvantage, to do those applications with a bit of support. So we're really keen on making sure those vulnerable numbers don't drop. So
Okay.
yeah, I feel like that's a really positive thing.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, yeah, Ben.
Just the last comment. This has been really tough for everybody, more for Rachel and Bev and other colleagues. I just wanted to say a huge thank you, because we know this is a really difficult area. We know that we collectively haven't got it right in the past, and early years feels like an afterthought from the DFE, I believe. I hope the message is getting out, not from us. The way that we managed the meeting on Friday, so Louise isn't with us today, but Louise and Bev there was loads of challenge in the room, but it was done really professionally. I felt we all learned a lot from each other. It's exactly the way we should be working. So a huge thank. And Rachel, I know you couldn't be with us, and I know you've got, but the feedback you've given us in writing, and the challenge, and then the support that you give us as well, that's exactly what we want. It's exactly the way we should be working. So it's really grateful for the input. And I think lots more to go. And I'm signed up to coffee and catch up now, which sounds great. Although I didn't realise it was on Teams, and I have to bring my own coffee. I was hoping to get a slice of cake or something. But yeah, so it was a really good session on Friday, and lots more of this. It helps us all learn, it helps us all understand, and we will address those issues that have been raised by colleagues. And we'll keep doing that lobbying on behalf of the early years sector. We had that conversation about how unfair it is that underspending in early years just disappears. It should go out to early years providers. That's all of our views. We need to change the DFE's mind on that. Yeah, so just a thank you.
Absolutely. Are there any more questions? Then I'll move on
Just to jump in, Chair, that we did receive apologies from Louise Danielchuk after the start of the meeting. So apologies from her.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Emily, the council's budget.
Yeah, so the council's released details of its final budget plans for next financial year, and that's going to be considered at Cabinet a week today and at full council later on this month. So the draft budget, this follows the draft budget that went to December Cabinet for consultation. So the final budget includes consideration of the process and feedback following the consultation process. The provisional local government finance settlement was received on the 18th of December, which was after the publication of our draft budget. And the final local government finance settlement was only received yesterday. So the final budget still includes some assumptions around funding, which was based on the provisional settlement. So there may be further funding changes to incorporate following the final budget. So the key headlines are that the council is proposing a balanced revenue budget of in the region of 960 million, but excluding the 530 odd million DSG budget, the council's revenue budget is 432 million. So the budget includes an average council tax increase of 2.99%, as well as the allowable adult social care precept, which is 2%. So the maximum 4.99%, which is allowable before triggering a local referendum. And that equates to an increase of £88.73 per year, or £1.71 a week on a Band D property. So there are some local authorities that have proposed increasing their council tax above the limit, which has triggered obviously a local referendum. I think there's about 6 other councils that have done that. So obviously reflective of the challenging position around local government finances as well. So going into the budget setting process, the council went for a similar process to what we've done for the high needs budget, where we've identified sort of our structural deficit based on in-year monitoring information, and then we've looked at demography, demand, complexity and inflation on top of that. So we went into the budget setting process with an estimated gap against our funding of £53 million. Through a Star Chambers process and a series of budget clinics, the council's been able to set a balanced budget. So the key pressures that the council face are around children and adult social care, homeschool transport and temporary accommodation. The council's budget includes one-off investment totalling £1.5 million, which is for the continuation of SEND improvement activities and also around the development of family hubs as well. So as well as the revenue one-off investment that's been put aside for family hubs, there's 2 million included in the capital programme as well for that next financial year. So the capital programme for the council totals 100 million, and that, like I say, includes the 2 million for family hubs, but it'll also include the sum of money that we've put inside for schools and SEND expansion as well. And just in terms of the revenue as well, the education budget's largely been protected from savings or efficiencies. So they're the key headlines in relation to the council's general fund budget.
Okay, any questions normally on that? No?
Well, I know Emily said it really clearly. I think the message that I've certainly received as an officer, we started with a £53 million black hole, and we're still investing more money than we have in education and in children and in early help. So for me, as a as an education and a children's professional, that's what I've done all my life. It feels like a really good place to be, because at the moment there are lots of counterparts up and down the country that are having budgets cut significantly. So the commitment from the council to invest in children and young people, I think is brilliant. I think it's laudable. It really shows that commitment to making this, to get to fixing some of the issues we've got. So I'm really pleased, obviously.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've been working with a special school trust in Birmingham, and they just had their transport taken away for the post-16. So half the kids just can't attend because they got severe physical and learning difficulties. So yes, it's good that those things have been protected and are still in place within our areas here, because they're not everywhere. Is there any questions? No? Okay. So the next forum meeting date, the next date, 20th of May. James, anything? Yes, please.
Colleagues who are in the room, what you were talking about the language actually is a constant battle that I have with them. I call it officer speak, not real people speak. It's not, I kind of felt it sounded a little derogatory to say that you wanted in plain language, but actually so do I. So does everybody, because sometimes things are hidden and you think, what on earth does that mean? And you just need it. So I just wanted to say that he knows that.
Thank you. Thanks, Fiona. So the next meeting dates are set out, and the standing agenda items, we look forward to having a wrap up on the high needs and obviously report back and hopefully some feedback, customer feedback from schools to make sure that the system is working as reported and that we've not got our quite a backlog of issues to deal with, and with the outturn from the early years as well, which will come through. There is, I would remind everyone, to think about an election of chair and vice chair. So if you'd like to let James know of nominations, if you'd like to be nominated, please let James know.
I'd like to nominate Paul as chair. Thank you. There you go. We've sorted that already. That's already sorted ahead of next meeting, and Eliza as vice as well, so we can sort that whilst we're at it. There you go.
I'll second it.
Okay, I think with that, I haven't been. Oh, sorry, Jim.
Just wanted to dive in before you, just two really quick things under AOB. Next time, Louisa Jones would like to be here with myself and give a bit of an update alongside the high needs and the DSG deficit management plan. The other thing, and I'm sorry because I forgot to do this. Andy has worked really hard delivering this project, and he's come in, he's tried to really drive it through. Andy leaves us at the end of March. It was a fixed term contract, so he does. So I just want to put on record my thanks for Andy, because he's picked something up that was in a real mess, frankly. And I know it's not perfect, but I think he's driven it forwards really well. So I just wanted to say and put on record a thanks from me, and I know from colleagues within the council. And I'll send best wishes, obviously, to Andy as he moves on to things far more exciting like early retirement. Lucky so-and-so. So I just wanted to explain that.
Yeah, and thank you. Thanks for letting us know, Ben. And if you pass on our thanks from Forum too. It's not these big change projects are never easy to get through, and we appreciate the work Andy's done on that. Okay, I think with that, there's no other urgent business, so I declare the meeting closed. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming.